Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share an update on my experience with the Sony a7C. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar with this camera, it is a marvel, I'll tell you that right now. This is the smallest full-frame mirrorless interchangeable lens camera that Sony has ever made. I can't say it's the smallest full-frame camera with an interchangeable lens system on Earth, because I do have something right here, the Sigma FP, that is actually smaller than it. But focusing on the a7C, this is a fairly amazing camera in my opinion. Now, many will say it's just an A7 Mark III crammed into an APS-C Sony body. And to some degree, there is truth to that. But I would make the argument this camera has an identity all of its own, and I also believe a customer base all of its own. Now, it isn't perfect. It does have some key benefits over the 2-year-old A7 Mark III, besides the fact that it's smaller, and ergonomics are still fairly good. One of the key benefits is this display. It is the same display that Sony's been basically putting on all of their new cameras, fully articulating, that will allow you to pull off shots you traditionally wouldn't be able to with the fixed articulating display of years past. In fact, of every Sony camera in the past. So that's one advantage besides size that it has over the A7 Mark III. Another is its autofocus system. So this camera may only have the same sensor as the A7 III, a 24 megapixel full frame sensor, which, by the way, is for many of you out there a sweet spot. But the autofocus system, the real-time tracking capability that this camera has, does make it, in my opinion, far better than the A7 III, unless you prefer to have a still camera first, and only for that matter, because the beauty of the A7 III was that it was a great hybrid. But because this has real-time tracking and the same sensor and newer hardware, that inherently makes it better, unless you prefer the ergonomics of the A7 III, which I'm sure many of you out there do. One thing that I'm not impressed by, which I knew I wouldn't be, is the EVF, and that's because we're basically dealing with the same EVF you'd find on any APS-C mirrorless camera from Sony that I've covered in the past, which leaves a lot to be desired. It's better than not having any electronic viewfinder, but it certainly doesn't compare to what we're used to in their full-frame world. But that is one of the compromises of making a camera so powerful, so small, is that they're going to have to basically compromise somewhere. And the EVF seems, in my opinion, to be that compromise. Now, beyond that, as I mentioned, I'm impressed with the sharpness of this 28 to 60 mil kit. You know, I'm traditionally accustomed to telling people stay away from the kit glass, and for good reason. Kit glass generally is exactly that. It's a good starting point, but oftentimes you're better served investing in a all-in-one piece of glass, a zoom lens that is of a higher quality that you'll get more use out of. In this case, I have to say, with the balance and the fit and finish and the range of this lens, I can recommend it. So for someone who is starting out in photography, or they are just ready to go full frame, I think this is a really good, inexpensive starting piece of glass that makes, or at least maintains, the overall form factor of this camera very well. When I compare it to other full frame glass that I have just sitting here, and I've shown it in videos from the past, you know, something like the Zeiss 16 to 35, or another lens I've been using on this, the G Master 24 to 70, these things are huge compared to this little kit zoom lens. So I expect that Sony will continue to build on this new form factor, because they wouldn't have made a camera like this if they didn't intend to. It is fully weather sealed. That doesn't mean it's waterproof. Don't get things mixed up here, but I can tell already from my limited experience with it that the weather sealing seems to be better, just because of redesigning the I/O ports in a fashion that just doesn't exist on the A7R4 or even the A7S III. Now, don't get confused there either, because this is missing a lot of things that those cameras have. The A7S III, for example, I mentioned in a previous video about this, that it had active steady shot. It does not, unfortunately. And that's something I wish they would have incorporated into this. That was a mistake. I stand to be corrected, as always. And, of course, prefer to get things right, even if it takes a correction. So no active steady shot. We do have traditional steady shot, but active steady shot is something you'll find in the a7S III. You'll find it even in little cams like this guy right here, the ZV-1. You'll also find it probably in just about every new full-frame camera that Sony will make. It's in the RX100 line, at least in the form of the Mark VII. It's in as well the A6600. I would like to see it in a camera like this because the beauty of having this form factor, yes, it's got the 5-axis image stabilization and then steady shot from the lens, but if we had active steady shot, it would just take this camera's game to another level. Another thing I want to talk about, the menu system. So a lot of people, I think, believed that they would get the menu system that lives in the a7S III. After all, this camera came out after the a7S III. But again, Sony clearly drawing lines about what price points will grant you. And in this case, the a7S III menu system is going to live only on pro-grade cameras. And this is really meant to bridge the APS-C and full-frame realm. And I think it does an incredibly good job at precisely delivering that experience. For those of you who have followed my photography coverage, specifically Sony cameras, of course, over the years, you already know I've always said I love the balance and the form factor of APS-C lenses from Sony, but the reality is that because you can use their full-frame glass on APS-C bodies, and some of them are not too large, it's usually worth investing in the full-frame glass just in case you ever migrate. Well, here is the camera that Sony dropped in order to essentially migrate all of those users. Now, does this kill their APS-C business? I don't think it kills it, but it certainly makes it far more compelling to get a full-frame camera. Better dynamic range, better overall quality, pretty much in every respect, better color science, because that you are getting here, something that you wouldn't get even with my A7R IV. The color science and real-time tracking, well, the real-time tracking exists, but the color science is a big difference for those of you who actually care about it. Beyond that, it's really, again, all about the form factor, all about this display being essentially malleable to whatever situation you need it to accommodate. And then when it comes to battery life, with the Type-Z battery, and this is basically just an enlarged A6600 body, you get pretty solid specs on both still and video. We're talking about over 700 shots. Mixed usage, my experience has been, pretty good still, and I expected that because ever since Sony introduced the Type-Z battery, we entered a new realm. The question was, when would they make a smaller body, and by smaller I mean just about half the size of their general full-frame offerings, with that Type-Z battery, with the autofocus system that you have, at least in the A7 III, but now with the added processing capability, as I've mentioned, of real-time tracking that just doesn't live in those older Sony cameras. A relocation of the video record button. This is now par for the course. It's become pretty much standard from what I've seen on Sony cameras. The a7S III, of course, I just broke out the ZV-1 where the record button has also been relocated. So there is this natural progression to relocate the video capture button to a dedicated button right behind the shutter button. I think that's a good move. Now, you do have a hot shoe. Of course, you can use Sony's proprietary mic, which I highly recommend. It still keeps this wireless. It still keeps it low profile, and it just, sips the battery inside of this camera. This is my A7R IV, and this just gives you an idea. Granted, it's in a cage, but just think about this for a second. With the Sigma 14 to 24 zoom lens, which, by the way, is a phenomenal piece of glass for anyone looking for an alternative. Check out my coverage of the Sigma lenses that I have in studio now. Just think about this for a moment. Both of these are full-frame cameras. Both of them live with the same menu system, the same hot shoe. Of course, the EVF on the A7R IV is another class. Of course, both of them, when it comes to autofocus performance, are a wash. Real-time tracking, also pretty much a wash. But at the end of the day, what does the A7R IV have in its favor? Well, again, if you prefer the ergonomics of a larger camera, it's got that. Of course, more dials, mode dials, but not really. And then in addition to that, beyond the better EVF, as I already stated, there's really not that much more other than the actual raw resolution that the A7R4's 60 plus megapixel sensor has to offer, which is why you pick up an R series A7 to begin with. You're looking for more than the base level of resolution afforded by cameras like this and the A7 III. So again, just for perspective, look at that size difference. I know there's a cage. I could bring out my A7R II. I've done that in the past. But the beauty of this, again, form factor, all of the updates in terms of technology, but most importantly, that real-time tracking, a hot shoe that is actually compatible with the shotgun mic that I just broke out, which has been on sale for under $300. I think it's an absolute must-have if you care about audio quality. If you want to vlog, if you want to take great images, still have very solid video, this is going to do it all. Again, I wish we had active steady shot. I misspoke in my previous video, but regardless of that, I've just been really impressed. I'm going to reiterate, with the kit lens. I've tried to predominantly shoot with that just because I feel like a lot of users are going to go with this combo. Even though it is still going to be over $2,000, I feel like this is a really solid all-in-one solution that if you want to travel with one camera and one lens, yes, I wish it was a little bit wider, but it really does a very good job, surprisingly so. I did not expect the kit lens to be one worthy of recommending. And so far, I haven't seen a reason to tell any of you to avoid it. So again, if you already have existing Sony glass and you're just interested in the body, then the lens becomes irrelevant, right? I mean, then it's just all about this guy right here. And I can tell you without any hesitation, this is worth it. And I am very tempted. I especially like the silver black combo. I didn't get that here in my review sample, but 10 frames per second, you've got a really nice buffer on this camera. It's performance we never got in this form factor. So for every naysayer, every person out there saying, what the hell, why did Sony do this? I know exactly why they did it. They did it because they could, and they did it because if you know anything about Sony's mirrorless business, it's always been about peak performance in the smallest form factor possible. And they moved away from that for years now. I mean, as they evolved and became more dominant and eventually really the #1 mirrorless camera manufacturer in the world, their DI business is that robust, we just got cameras that were larger and larger and lenses to match. Now we have a return to best-in-class performance for its ounceage. And that is, in my opinion, something very much worth the asking price that they've slapped on this. Now, of course, it's $1,800 body price. It will drop, so that'll be beneficial for those of you that are interested. And I think the APS-C business will continue because it does still offer a much lower price point. I mean, I just sold my A6500, I mentioned in a previous video, for $800 US. So think about that. That's less than half of the price of this camera. And many people still don't need full frame. And this isn't capable of 4K 60, so you're still living in a 4K 30 world with this. And yes, you have the quick and slow, the high frequency, or slow and quick, I should say, recording mode for slow motion, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Of course, nothing matches the A7S III out of the box, but I don't expect that with this. This is, again, all about getting the best hybrid solution you possibly can, literally in the palm of your hand. And so far, with a little under 700 points of phase detection in that hybrid, phase contrast system, I do wish we had a real touchscreen display. It's a limited touchscreen display, but these are gripes that aren't really gripes. This is more about, we're looking at the smallest full frame interchangeable lens camera that Sony has ever made. And if the biggest complaint that I have is the lack of active steady shot and the EVF, they've done a really good job. And that is really right now, in my opinion, the two biggest complaints that I could possibly have. And they're not complaints, they're just things you need to know. Now, I am left eye dominant. I mentioned that in a previous video about this camera. So that's a challenge for me to begin with, but that's a challenge I've lived with all of their APS-C cameras. So in previous APS-C coverage, I never took a dump on the EVF, but I always made people aware that it wasn't my favorite solution. I much prefer the center EVF that they've integrated onto their larger form factor A7 series full frame cameras. I mean, the one on the A7S III is just magic with that resolution and field of view. But we've got to take into account the body size again. And if you want to travel light, if you want one camera that can do it all and that you don't need to have a gear bag in order to take with you, you're looking at it. And so that is the value of this camera. Again, still getting 10 frames per second with an incredible autofocus system, real-time tracking on video. You can just select your subject and it will follow it. That is the whole premise of putting a camera in auto and letting it do the work for you. So this is not designed, I'm not saying it's not for manual shooters, but manual shooters that are complaining about they would have preferred to see something else, this camera wasn't meant for them. This camera was designed, again, to be the perfect bridge from APS-C to full frame and not intimidate users with over-aggressive styling, large bodies. And let's just see what they develop with these smaller E-mount lenses. I mean, this is a good starting point. I want to see more, though. And the fact that, again, this is probably the most impressive kit lens I've ever seen Sony make says a lot about how far they've come. I mean, the last one was their power zoom, which is, it was serviceable, but it was basically a piece of junk. And I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. I used it for underwater photography, and that was it. And that's because it was all that could fit in the underwater enclosure I had for my A6500. In this instance, I absolutely think it's a good match. It's a good pairing. So it's really all about budget, how much weight you want to carry, and if this does satisfy your needs, which I think for the majority of shooters out there, this is a really solid hybrid. And if it doesn't suit your budget, APS-C is still there to save the day. And of course, you can look at cameras like the A7 III, but there is no way I would pick the A7 III over this camera simply because of the real-time tracking and the LCD display being fully articulating. Now, in the past, I wasn't sure that I was going to be in love with that screen. Times have changed. I've really enjoyed it with the ZV-1. Really enjoyed shooting with it on the A7S III. And it is hard to go back once you have it. And as a Sony user, this didn't exist up until a little while ago. It began with the ZV-1. So started in the cybershot realm, and now we're seeing it APS-C, full frame. It's coming across the board. I don't think we're going to see any new Sony cameras that do not integrate this sort of display. I'm excited to see what we get with the new RX10, hopefully sooner than later, the new RX100. Those were typically addressed around summer or this time of the year. They're not here, but we are living through a pandemic, and that is likely the reason why. But either way, I can tell you right now, even though this isn't my full review, it kind of probably sounds like it is, this is one of the best cameras of 2020 and will be through 2021, not because it changes the game in terms of performance, but because it changes the game in terms of performance in almost a pocketable form factor. And when I bring out other cameras to put side by side, they all just look gigantic, except for Sigma's FP, and they're appealing to different crowds, in my opinion, completely, which is part of the reason I wouldn't compare this to the FP. The FP is really a cinema camera that takes full frame stills. This, on the other hand, is completely a hybrid and a bridge for Sony's APS-C users. And if you're not an APS-C user and you're thinking about it, again, this should all come down to budget. And if budget isn't an issue, highly recommend this. Go with the A7C. You will not regret it. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that subscribe, hit that like button. Please feel free to subscribe. And of course, as usual, please stay safe. Later.